Over the years, when I've been designing gardens or teaching others to design their own gardens, I've been asked many times what would be a good alternative to a lawn. This was a hard one to answer because I was always reluctant to just say, well, try paving. Then about 10 years ago, I became aware of research done by a postgrad student on an alternative to grass lawns. A pretty radical approach considering how wedded the English are to their mowing, weeding and feeding regimes, not to mention stripes. Lionel Smith, now Dr Lionel Smith, worked on integrating horticultural knowledge with ecological science to create a low green covering for year-round interest and increased biodiversity without the need for chemicals or intensive maintenance. He called this new kind of planting a tapestry lawn. I was completely sold on the idea and I kept recommending it to anyone who expressed an interest. Then, of course, I realised that I had to try it for myself. So this film is about that experience, what I did, how well it worked, and would I carry on recommending it? I'm very grateful to Dr Smith for opening my eyes to the new possibilities of tapestry lawns. I've used his book extensively in my project, and details of it are at the end of the film. I should apologise to him in advance for any mistakes I've made in interpreting his work. So we begin in the greenhouse, sowing seeds.
So what are we doing here in the greenhouse?
Well, because we are going to need a lot of plants for our tapestry lawn experiment, we'll have to grow them ourselves. We need about 12 different kinds of plant, and for each of those kinds of plant, we're going to need a lot of little baby seeds, seedling plants. So it would be really expensive to buy them, even if we could source them easily. So I'm going to grow most of them from seed, with one or two more that are coming from cuttings. Well, that's the plan anyway.
Am I going to recognise any of these plants?
I'm sure you'll know some of them. We've got a tiny wild pansy called heartsease. We've got lovely purple self-heal. We've got yellow and orange bird's foot trefoil and the beautiful little blue harebell. And those are all wildflowers you might see around here. But we've also got a kind of pink, a dianthus, and we've got two kinds of small-leaved thyme. Now they'll all be from seed, but I've also got a special chamomile to go in. It stays lower to the ground than ordinary chamomile, so it's more suitable for our tapestry lawn. And this one is sterile, so we have to buy the growing plants, and if we propagate them, it'll have to be from cuttings. So all the plants for this bit of tapestry lawn are able to cope with lots of sun and soil that drains freely. Because remember, the area by the summer house is made up ground. It's always the first bit to struggle when the weather's very dry. So some of the seeds will have to go in the heated propagator to get them started, but a nice easy one should be the orange hawkweed. I'm using seed compost because we don't want anything with high levels of nutrients for these really young seeds, especially wildflower plants. I've got a clean mushroom tray with holes made in the bottom, and I'll almost fill it with the compost. Oh, a bit lumpy. And I'm just going to firm that down a bit with my firming thing. So I've left a gap on the top. So there we go. Now I'm going to sieve a little bit more compost into that gap. Something very nice and fine. You could use perlite for that, or you could use vermiculite, but anything to avoid having lumps for our little tiny germinating seeds to have to negotiate. So now the seed goes on top. Now this seed is extremely fine, so I'm going to mix it with a little bit of dried sand. And this means I can just handle it a bit more easily. So I'll just mix it up nicely and get ready to spread it on the surface. So those seedlings, seeds should be nicely distributed throughout. Now, because it's very fine seed, I'm not going to cover it over. It doesn't need that challenge. So I'm going to just write a label so we know what it is. And that's the hawkweed, 2022. In with the label. And now I'm going to water it from underneath by standing it in a tray of water. If I watered it from the top, there's a danger that we'd wash all those little seeds down into one corner, and that would be a bit of a disaster. So I'm going to use a tray without holes and take some fresh tap water in preference to stored rainwater.
Why is that?
Well, it's really important that we do everything we can to keep these seeds away from bacteria and other unpleasantness. And stored water is great, you know, water from the water butt, but it can be full of nasties, and these seedlings will be very vulnerable when they germinate.
Is that it? Are we done?
Nearly. I need to make sure the seeds won't dry out, and I could put them in a clean plastic bag and seal the bag up, but that's a bit heavy on bags for so many seeds. So I'm going to use an old propagator lid, just because I have some.
So when can we look forward to seeing the young plants?
I may have forgotten to say that some of this seed will take ages to germinate, and by ages I mean it could be months or even years before plants are ready to go into the lawn.
No, I don't believe you mentioned that before.
So now it's the second week in May, and it's time for me to take the cuttings from the chamomile. But while we're in the greenhouse, I thought you might like to see how some of the other things are coming on. These are things that we sowed seed of in February, and some things like the heartsease come on pretty well, and they're even flowering, really very jolly. Of course, the flowering isn't really the principal reason for doing this. We want the mat of foliage, but nevertheless, I think the heartsease are really cute. Some things have done well, like the hawkweed, which will be lovely sort of orange spikes. So they're coming on nicely. They're making a nice mat in our tray. So that's really encouraging. Some things have taken a lot longer than I was anticipating, which is going to throw the timing of this project a little bit. So this is thyme, this is magic carpet, and they were very tiny when they germinated, tiny little seedlings, and they've been pricked out now for a couple of weeks and they're just beginning to make progress, but you can see there's no way that they're ready to go outside. The tile would just crumble to pieces if we tried doing anything with those. So some good progress. Some things haven't worked at all well, and this is the campanula. Now, there are one or two germinating. They're quite erratic, and they are absolutely minute. And it might look to you as if this seed tray is really dry and in need of a drink, but actually that's not the case. It's really very moist, but it's cracked because of the actual plastic tray is flexing. So the campanula are going to be, they're not going to be in a position to contribute very much to this tapestry lawn. So I think I almost have to anticipate doing without them and maybe just trying something else, or in fact making our proposed area slightly smaller to fit what we've actually got growing quite successfully. But today it's going to be the chamomile, and the chamomile can't be done from seed because this is a sterile hybrid, so we're obliged to take cuttings or use division. Now, I haven't done this before, so I'm not entirely sure how it's going to work. However, I've watered the baby plants. I've got 4 of these, so I can't really afford to mess up. So they're nice and wet, water dripping out the bottom. And I'm going to plant them in a mixture of seed, compost and perlite. So it's 3 parts seed compost to 1 part perlite. So in order to do that, I'll just put on my little gloves here. The compost has dried out rather in the greenhouse while I've been sort of thinking about this, but I will give the seed tray a really good soaking once I've taken the cuttings. So the perlite will help with the drainage. And the chamomile is a plant that likes lots of sunshine, a reasonably fertile soil, but really good drainage. Otherwise, it just won't be happy at all. So that's reasonably well mixed together. So we've got some holes in the container, and I'll just try and get that nice and full to the top without too many lumps, and just firm it a bit, just like we did with the seeds, really. So that's our compost prepared. So I'm going to pop that there, and I'm going to use a scalpel to see what's going on. When I get in there, I'm really not sure what we're going to find, but in order to try and keep things nice and clean, I'm going to just sterilise the blade a little bit. These fleshy shoots are quite vulnerable, so I just want to make sure we're not exposing them to any unnecessary harm. Pop that there. I'm also, while I'm think of it, I'm going to moisten some pieces of kitchen paper, because as I take the cuttings, it's really important that I keep them damp. So just put those to one side so I can pop the cuttings as I take them in among those shoots. So the first plant I've got here is really just to show you how this has run up into a flower spike. I think this is unusually tall. This is quite a compact chamomile, but I've left the flower spike on just so you can kind of see how that's developing. We won't let it do that in the actual chamomile lawn, in the tapestry lawn. It'll be cut off. So you can see this is nice and moist, and all the books say to find a nice, strong, healthy leaf and trace it back to just below the surface of the soil, and try and see if you can find a couple of roots developing. But I think because this is such a compact form of chamomile, one single leaf, it isn't going to be possible to track that back. So what we're going to end up doing is probably teasing out little clumps, which is kind of what I mean between saying I'm not quite sure whether these are going to be cuttings or whether these are actually going to be divisions. Anyway, nothing ventured, nothing gained. I'm going in to see what I can find. It's actually quite difficult to... I'm going to have to resort to ripping it apart with my fingers. And this may well represent the way that this was propagated initially. It may have been from a series of cuttings put into one pot. So I think this is probably going to be a sort of hybrid between a cutting and a division. So I'm going to have to cut that. It's really surprisingly tough. So what we've got now is a little cluster of leaves rather than a single leaf, and it has some roots attached to it. So far so good. I'll put that in among the leaves of the kitchen paper, which is nice and damp, and see if we can pull that off again, see what else we've got going on in here. So I'm very anxious not to mess up here, because these plants were expensive and hard to find. So there's one there that's just got a single bit of root. That's not brilliant, but we'll go with that anyway. Put that nicely away. Now, I think because those pieces have come out with much more root on than I was anticipating, they turned out to be divisions rather than cuttings, I'm going to have to abandon this small tray and fill a larger tray so that I can make much more room for them to be correctly spaced. So, bit of a pause while I have a think about doing that. Well, now I've managed to find a full-sized seed tray. My original plan was just to start off the little cuttings in a small tray and then move them on into a tray like this. But once I began to realise that they weren't really cuttings, they were little divisions that already had a root system, it became obvious to me that I couldn't keep them in that little tray. So I prepared a big tray, which equates to the ones that we've been using for all the seedlings. So that's kind of neat, so that I won't have to move them again once they're properly rooted. So that's sort of an advantage, although I was a bit taken by surprise. What I've been doing when I've been pricking out the other seedlings that have come on, is I've just been trying to get 8, maybe 9, 10 in a a tray. And this is a bit arbitrary really, because I simply don't know in some cases how quickly things are going to come on. But anyway, let's see if we can get these into the tray before they get a bit too sort of dried. So we've got quite a big root system here, so I'm going to have to coax in some instances and see how it goes. So the compost is looking pretty dry at the moment, but rest assured I shall make sure this is soaked very well by standing it in a container of water and having the water go up from underneath. I'm finding that's been a much better way of doing it than watering from the top. So I can see now I've got my little chamomile. I've got 8, 9, 10, 11 in there, so I should carry on and do the other 3 pots worth. I'll cut the flower head off this one because that's of no consequence at all. And I'm going to stand this in my bath now so this can get really nice and moist. Then I'm going to take them out of the greenhouse because it's getting so hot now in the greenhouse. I mean, right now it's 28 degrees in here, even with all the ventilation open. So I'll find somewhere shady where these can just settle. And we'll just see how they get on. I'm fairly optimistic. I'm really quite pleasantly surprised at how that's gone, and the number of really good quality cuttings I've got from that one pot. Great. So now it's the beginning of June, and it's time to push our Tapestry lawn project on a bit. The plants at the moment are all growing on quite well, but they're in a place that's slightly shady. I'm keen to get them out here where it's bright and free draining and sunny, to get them acclimatized to their positions. They've all been chosen to cope with these conditions, but I think just as soon as I can get them out of the shady area, that will be a good thing. So I brought down my plan on which I'd proposed this shape, and I've put it on the ground using canes, and I've marked it out with a couple of tape measures. This was originally intended to be about 4 square metres. I think we may have lost a tiny bit through just tweaking it to fit nicely into this circular lawn that we have here already. I've left a nice broad margin between the end of the edge of the conventional lawn and the edge of the tapestry lawn, which I think will provide a good contrast in textures between the old lawn and the new tapestry lawn. And it's interesting to notice that just in the short time we've been growing these plants in the lawn, we've got a few little things already seeded. We've got this little magenta geranium has found its way in. We've got some medic coming on over there. Here we've got some white clover. So some unexpected visitors just arrived since we've taken a slightly more hands-off approach to looking after this lawn. So this is our complete offering, everything that we've grown. How is it done? Well, starting down this end, we've got 4 trays of the chamomile, and the chamomile was the one that we grew from cuttings stroke divisions, and this was only back in May, so quite a few of them have done really well, but I suspect they've been somewhere that's a little bit too damp and a bit too shady for them, and 1 or 2 little bits may have succumbed to slug damage or just not done very well. Better, in every case, are 4 trays of self-heal, which is done incredibly well, really dense, tight cover. The heartsease have been good. They've been flowering for ages, but we have to remember, of course, the tapestry lawn isn't really about flower. Flower is a bonus. So we will lose some of these flowers when the lawn is properly functioning and being trimmed, but nevertheless, we'll have some, and they're really pretty. The Times have struggled a bit. They went in later than some of the other seed. The larger of the 2 is okay. We've got 2 or 3 trays of that one, but the very small leaf thyme I think is struggling. Again, too much shade where I've been keeping them. But we've got 2 or 3 trays of that, so that's okay. Here we've got the bird's foot trefoil. They've done extremely well. In fact, they did so well that I trimmed some of them back a few weeks ago to try and make them bush out. Some success, but later on, before I set them out in their final resting place, I will trim them again because we really don't want this length of growth just flopping about. Similarly, with the various dianthus, the pinks, they've grown fantastically well. They were so easy to grow from seed, but they do need to be trimmed quite hard now, I think, to stop them opening up and getting leggy. And then we've got a couple of trays of geranium Bill Wallace, which I grew from seedlings that I'd found elsewhere in the garden. So that was a useful thing to be able to lift those up, put them in trays. They are a bit sparse, so I'm not sure they're a brilliant choice. They were suggested for the tapestry lawn, but we'll see how well they perform. And after all, that is the point of this, is to see how well a lot of these things do. And then finally, we've got 4 very hearty trays of hawkweed, and it's the hawkweed that really demonstrates how well they've done. They've rooted through and they've made a very, very strong, compact root system to give us this tile effect that we wanted for all of our plants, but we've achieved with varying degrees of success. But nevertheless, we'll get them set out in a moment and see how it looks. So I'm going to trim these heartsease. You can see they've run up and flowered. I don't think there's any great skill required. I'm just going to neaten them up and hope that, well, 1, they won't put any energy into making seed, and 2, they'll go on to make rather neater, tighter plants. So I think that's probably sufficient. So I'm going to start placing them out. I won't plant them today. I'm not convinced that some of them have rooted through sufficiently, but I want them to be out here so we can see what we're short of and get them acclimatized. So here we go. I'm going to keep plants of the same kind together so they get a bit more opportunity for impact and growing together correctly. I think setting them out a bit like tiles or brickwork will probably be a good idea to help them mesh together. I don't think there's anything particularly clever about this. We'll just get on and do it. Obviously it gets a bit approximate when we get to the edges, but I understand that they will just kind of blend in the fullness of time. Of course, while they're sitting here for the next couple of weeks, they will actually start to kill off the grass underneath, which will be a help for us. So here we are, we've set them out. I followed the back line of the tapestry lawn edge fairly faithfully, but as you can see, we've got some gaps. So I've had to modify. I've come in slightly from the inside edge. Originally, when I planned this, I had allowed for something like 48 of these trays, huge number. And of course, we didn't get a fantastic germination with some of the things. So, for example, with the heartsease, we only got 2 trays instead of 4 trays. So I've ended up with something like 30 trays to work with. So, of course, we've got gaps. I'm not unduly worried because we can dig up some of the baby geranium Bill Wallace. I think we said earlier that there was some growing in the lawn. I can dig those up in the next few days, plant them into some trays just like these, and within 2 or 3 weeks I'm hoping that they will be almost catching up with the geranium Bill Wallace that we've got here already. So that's okay, we can cope with that. The other thing we've had to bear in mind today is that because the plants are not going to be put in the ground, I can't divide the trays up into halves or thirds to fill in the little gaps that will help to give us our nice curving line. So that's something that we'll have to wait until I'm actually able to get them in the ground, and then we can get that subtle curve reformed. So I'm not unduly disheartened that we haven't got the full perfect layout. I think this is a pretty good attempt so far. So here they are. They'll be looked after in the open here in good sunny conditions, we hope, for the next few weeks until they've all rooted to the same degree as the hawkweed, and then I think we'll be good to go. So here we are at the end of July and the weather has not been cooperative. we've had an extended dry spell and I've delayed getting the tapestry lawn tiles into position. And then last week we had temperatures in the mid-30s. So here we are, we've still got them out of the ground. They've been here for a little while and I've had to irrigate them, which I wasn't too pleased about, but we didn't want to lose them at this stage. So today we're going to try to get them in the ground. I'm intending to cut round the trays on the outside of the crescent using my trusty edging iron. We'll have to make a few adjustments as we go because we've had some casualties. Down that end we found that the small leaved thymes just dried up and died. So there'll be a bit of tweaking, and I think this is going to be incredibly hard work because you can see how dry the rest of the lawn is, completely yellow and crispy, and it's going to be hard getting the edging iron into this, but we're going to have to keep going and try and do it today. Otherwise I think we're in danger of the project failing, which would be such a shame because these plants are showing such promise. We've got colour, we've got variety, we've got texture, all kinds of good things going on here, and I really don't want it to fail at this late stage. So let's get on with it. It's taken us the best part of the afternoon to get all the plants into their final resting place because it's been so hot and so dry. But you'll notice we didn't have enough plants to do absolutely every bit I was intending, and this turf has died off where it's been under some trays. I'm fairly confident that will come back once it's got some daylight and we can water it a bit. So my task now is to water well to get everything settled in, and then in a day or two I'm going to cut off a lot of this growth and this lovely flower and let things just thicken up and get their feet down into the soil underneath. It's been exactly a year since we planted the experimental tapestry lawn within our existing lawn, and 18 months since we began sowing the seeds in the greenhouse.
So has it worked out as well as you hoped?
Well, it's been interesting. The current trend for leaving the lawn grasses to grow longer is a good thing, but it's a hard sell for gardeners who like neatness. And let's not forget that a simple lawn is an excellent foil for densely planted flower borders. So having suggested to so many people that the tapestry lawn is a good alternative, I felt I had to try it for myself. Let's start with the biodiversity because that's a hard one to quantify. I'm not a scientist and this hasn't been a scientific experiment. So when the plants are in flower, it's obvious that they attract more insects and butterflies than just plain grass. Because of course the plants we've used have evolved to attract them with their bright flowers, whereas grasses are wind pollinated. However, proper studies elsewhere have claimed that in 3 months in the summer, a tapestry lawn will attract 80 times the visits by pollinators than a grass lawn. And where we have more insects, we have more food for creatures further up the food chain. But we have to remember that a tapestry lawn isn't intended primarily for flower anyway. It's to provide green cover all year round with associated benefits for many different invertebrates. And that's the hard part to quantify, really. I don't know how many extra creatures there are hanging around that wouldn't be there if this was just grass. I know that froglets like hiding from predators, so that's a plus, and a non-scientific poke reveals that it's much damper environment than the scorched lawn around it, so we assume home for beetles and earthworms and loads of other things.
What about the aesthetics?
I think it's a matter of personal taste, but this area did stay fairly neat with some occasional mowing, and it remained a rich green during the winter when the main lawn was a bit yellowy. But, and another but here, the bits of the main lawn that have been colonised with clover remain bright green too. The attractive flowers started to appear in March when the heartsease began to flower. This was a surprise because I hadn't realised that these had self-sown throughout the main lawn, and it gave a wonderful spangled effect, like a genuine flowery mead. And then from April we had the bird's foot trefoil. This was lovely, but I had to mow the area or risk it growing too tall. And it was obvious to me then that when this is grazed in the wild, it makes a much more compact plant. And I suppose this illustrates really why we can't just leave these plants to do their own thing. We have to intervene to a degree. In May, I found a rogue cowslip, which I definitely hadn't planted, but it must have come as a seed from elsewhere in the garden, and that was a really welcome addition. June saw the whole area explode into colour. The chamomile here coped extremely well with the unusually high temperatures we had then. I'm amazed at how well this has held its own against overtures from black medic that muscled in from the adjacent grass. In addition, we had and still have magenta geranium Bill Wallace, springing up here and there in the adjacent areas too. I introduced this from elsewhere in the garden, so it was a really welcome freebie. We had a few bare patches where the self-heal didn't do so well. Possibly it was too dry here, and we did have really high temperatures. The soil's really free draining too. Fortunately, and unexpectedly, it popped up in some other areas, nestling up against the white clover, so that was fine. I don't mind about that at all. Now it's July in our second summer, and look at these dianthus, aren't they an incredible colour? And I'm really impressed with what coverage they've managed to give us as well. And still to come, we have a second flowering of the fox and cubs, which has been really good early on. Now we've got mostly seed heads. And we've also got to look forward to the mass flowering of the thyme. Again, I've been surprised at just how dense the foliage is. It's lovely, fragrant foliage. But because it's so dense, we're managing to not have too many weeds coming up in it. This photograph was taken in October last year, 3 months after planting. And you can see here the good leaf colour and flowers from the fox and cubs, and the heartsease and geranium.
Has there been much ongoing maintenance?
It was a bit of a challenge to get things going last July, and I really wouldn't have chosen to plant them, but you know, hey ho. Things needed to be taken out of their trays, and we'd had a heat wave. So in terms of maintenance to begin with, there was watering, but mostly from the water butt, thank goodness. Since then, I've had to remove a few thistles, a few dandelions, and the black medic I mentioned earlier, but no feeding and no other intervention. Oh, I forgot the mowing. Mowing is quite important. I've cut the area 6 or 7 times since we planted it, so that's a year. Always on the highest setting, and of course always taking away the arisings.
Would you do it again?
Yes, I would. It looked absolutely lovely for surprisingly long periods. And even when it's not been in flower, it's had interesting textures and shades of green. And I know it's brought in more wildlife. The other thing is, of course, it's attracted a lot of attention from visitors, and you don't get that with a conventional lawn. I grew a lot of plants from seed, and I'm glad I went through the process. But an alternative would be to buy in young plants and also make more of those things that had self-seeded around in the garden. As long as you choose carefully and you plant densely enough, those things would work just as well, and be cheaper, of course. If you're still nervous about committing to a tapestry lawn, the least you can do, but with massive benefits, is to just step away from the lawn chemicals and let your grass grow just a little bit longer. It's maybe not as dramatic as having a tapestry lawn, but you'd be amazed at how much more wildlife you draw into the garden. And that can only be a good thing.